Okay, so this is a preview video for those who would like to have a short introduction to Book 10 before reading it and maybe have a sense of some of the major passages and a little bit of background. If you just want to launch into Book 10 fresh, feel free to do that too, but this is really for newer readers or for readers that want a quick review of Book 10 and the main points of Book 10. We're in the thick of some of the most famous sections of one of the most famous books ever, one of the most famous texts ever. And what we're in the middle of is, which is really important, isn't simply Odysseus's adventures, but it's Odysseus telling his adventures to Alcinous in the court of the Phaeacians. So we have to remember that all of these stories that we're hearing aren't happening in real time. These are flashback stories. This is King Alcinous asking Odysseus, tell us how you got here. And he's kind of walking him through. So in book 9, we heard of the three major events that happened after they left 10 years of hand-to-hand combat in the Trojan War. They raped and pillaged the next town they were in. They took the lotus flower. They took drugs, essentially, to forget their pain. And then they stole, essentially, from Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and had the sort of wild, crazy adventures and could have gotten away with it if it wasn't for Odysseus. If it wasn't for Odysseus going from saying he was no man, he couldn't seem to accept that, to then having to say who he was. Now that damns him into being Poseidon's enemy, and we learn that in this chapter, book 10, The Winds and the Witch, as Emily Wilson titles it, we learn sort of the next phase of Odysseus's attempts to return home and to return from war. So, firstly, we know on line 32, if you go to page 260 of the Emily Wilson translation, Odysseus is steering his ship. And curiously, there's just this little nugget here that I think is interesting. Maybe it's interesting to you too. He says in line 32 of book 10, I had been doing all the steering, hoping that we would get home sooner if I did. Now, why does this matter? Because if you notice in the very beginning of book 10, I'm going to go over the first two parts of book 10 quickly because they don't take up a lot of space, but he's in the land of the island of Aeolus, the very first line of book 10. And the king of Aeolus gives him a bag of winds. And this bag of winds is supposed to help them get home. And curiously, they're really, really close. They can actually, as it says in line 29 and 30, their native land appeared, and we were so near we saw men tending fires. That's how close they are. So, but here's this really quirky line, line 32. Odysseus says, I was doing all the work. Seems to be one of those control freak managers. So because he's been doing all the work, he falls asleep. And what do his men do near the bottom of page 260? They open the bag of winds, which moves them right from the edge of returning home to extremely far away from being home. They predictably go back to the island of Aeolus, who then call them God-forsaken and cursed. So that's the first part of this next phase of the story. I would argue isn't simply about navigation and wind and sailing. Pay close attention to Odysseus as a leader. I think there's clearly times he's a phenomenal, brilliant leader and who's very adaptable and can make things up, can improvise, can use the resources around him. Pay attention to this scene and pay attention to Odysseus as a leader. Worth talking about. Secondly, if you go to line 80, which is near the top of page 262, they row 6 more days. And this picture is kind of a spoiler, I admit, but it's the town of the Lastrygonians. And it's a town from which they barely escape. So I would just encourage you to maybe just put in the margins of 262, 263, the word giants, or, this is a moment where, and interestingly, they don't leave unscathed. Near the top of page 263, um, it says, second line from the top, the giantess at once summoned the king, her husband, from the council. He tried to kill my men, and grabbing one, he ate him up. So Odysseus does lose one of his men, and they barely escape this island. So we have the Cyclops, who are supernaturally sort of large and imposing, and here we have another population that's like that as well. Now, the main thrust of Book 10 is on the island of Aia. I always think of Wheel of Fortune like I want to buy a consonant here. But it's the Isle of Aia, which is the island of the goddess Circe. And this is where they land next, and where most of the events and the power of Book 10 comes from. Now, we have not only dealt with Athena, who is the most important female god in the poem. We have Penelope back home in Ithaca. We've met Calypso on the island of Ogygia. So Circe is another in a series of females. So we can start sensing maybe a pattern of what the women are like in this poem. And by no means are they carbon copies of each other, but maybe start sensing whether or not there's a pattern to this. So if you go to line 234 in the text, it's on page 266. So they go to the island of Circe, who's this beautiful goddess, and she has this magical potion you see here in the picture. And in line 234, it says she led them in, these are Odysseus's guys, sat them on chairs, and blended them a potion of barley, cheese, and golden honey mixed with Prenmian wine. She added potent drugs to make them totally forget their home. I would definitely mark that. Circle it, highlight it, bloodstains, whatever you have. Because when the lotus flowers were mentioned in the previous chapter, that's precisely what the power of the lotus flower is. It isn't simply the forgetting of pain, it's the forgetting of home. So the notion of nostalgia, the yearning for home, which is the prime motivator for you, Odysseus, is numbed, is dulled by drugs. So it says they took and drank the mixture, then she struck them using her magic wand and penned them in the pigsty. They were turned to pigs in body and voice and hair. And then this curious detail on line 241 that I would mark up. Their minds remained the same. Circe turns Odysseus's men into pigs, but doesn't turn their minds into the minds of pigs. I would definitely discuss this in your class. One might say that maybe she doesn't have the power to turn them completely. One might say that based on the behavior of these men since they've left the Trojan War, their minds are already the minds of pigs. There's a debate to be had there. I just think that's really interesting. Now, in an epic where Odysseus is constantly getting assists from Athena and here Hermes, this is just another example of divine assistance. Odysseus goes to rescue his men who've been turned into pigs. And Hermes, the messenger god, shows up, and on line 279, he says to Odysseus, "Why have you come across these hills alone?" This is just mark this whole bracket, this whole paragraph here. Hermes says, "You do not know this place, poor man." Not many people call Odysseus poor man. "Your men were turned to pigs in Circe's house and crammed in pens. Do you imagine you can set them free? You cannot. If you try that, you will not get back home." Again, Hermes, the reminder of the big picture. "You'll stay here with them, but I can help you. Here, take this antidote." And that is this plant you see here that we'll talk about. Hermes gives him this antidote to keep you safe while you go into Circe's house. Now, I will tell you all her lethal spells and tricks. She'll make you a potion mixed with poison. Its magic will not work on you because you have the herb I gave you. When she strikes you with her long wand, then draw your sharpened sword and rush at her as if you mean to kill her. She'll be frightened of you and will tell you to sleep with her. Do not hold out against her. She's a goddess. This is just such a weird passage. So take this potion, take this plant, then you can take her poisonous wine. Then when she approaches you, go to look like you're going to kill her and then sleep with her and it's okay. I mean, this is, this is not anything we would expect. But he says, don't hold out against her. She's a goddess. If you sleep with her, you will set free your friends and save yourself. Maybe that's the big picture. Tell her to swear an oath by all the gods that she will not plot further harm for you, or while you have your clothes off, she may hurt you, unmanning you. Again, pay attention in books where there's adequate information and then the author adds a detail that's unnecessary like that. So all Hermes has to say is, here's an antidote, and then, if you end up sleeping with her, make her promise that she's not going to harm you, and that way you'll be able to leave. That's enough. Hermes reminds him that if you don't make her swear to not harm you, not only would she hurt you, she would unman you, emasculate you, right? Cut off your private parts. He goes there. So I just find this like a really perverse, weird passage. So this plant that Hermes gives as the antidote, strangely enough, near the top of page 269 is called moly. And I was just poking around, and there's some debate as to whether this is the origin of the phrase holy moly. Holy moly. Some say it refers to the character Moses from the Old Testament. Some say it does come from this part of the Odyssey. I'm going to have to keep poking around. I'd be curious if anyone knows more definitively as to the etymology or the origins of the phrase holy moly. All right, so if you go to line 319, middle of the next page, Circe gives Odysseus the wine that she uses to poison people and to turn them into pigs. She tells Odysseus to go to the sty where all the other pigs are. And then nothing happens to Odysseus. Odysseus charges at her with her sword. And she says in that last stanza, around 324 on page 269, she says, again, the chorus of this entire epic poem, who are you? What everybody asks him. Where is your city and who are your parents? I am amazed you can drink my potion and yet not be bewitched. No other man has drunk it and withstood the magic charm. But you're different. Your mind is not enchanted. And then she says this thing out of nowhere. You must be Odysseus, the man who can adapt to anything. Make sure you're marking these up. So she even knows, and she's not even reading the Odyssey. You figure like we are. And then she continues, bright flashing Hermes of the golden wand has often told me you would sail here from Troy in your swift ship. Now sheathe your sword and come to bed with me. We can spend a lot of time on that sentence. Moving on. Through making love, we may begin to trust each other more. I don't know. I mean, if you've read enough ancient literature or literature in general, there's a lot of danger signs here, it seems to me. And Odysseus does the brilliant thing in the next chapter, which is to make her promise to not hurt him or her men. So he outsmarts her, but in a way, we can debate whether he outsmarts her. Without Hermes, he's dead. So, or he's a pig, I should say. He's a BLT. He's not dead. So that can be a debate. Is Odysseus being heroic here? So in line 382 on the next page, Odysseus ends up freeing his men, and then I just need you to go to line 482. I just think it's important to mention, I think it's 7 years he's with Calypso, if I remember correctly. He's with Circe on her island of Aea with his men for a year. So that's a whole other year of, again, sleeping with another supernaturally beautiful woman. So go to line 482 near the top of page 275. And he finally says to Circe, I want to go home. He pulls a Dorothy Gale from Wizard of Oz. And she tells him really scary news. She says on line around 485, she answered, Laertes' son, great King Odysseus, master of every challenge, you need not remain here in my house against your will. Okay, that's good news. But, first you must complete another journey. Go to the house of Hades. Hades is the underworld. We're going to talk about that more in the next chapter, but in a nutshell, it isn't hell, heaven. It's just the receptacle for dead. It's where all the dead people go. Go to the house of Hades and the dreadful Persephone and ask the Theban prophet, the blind Tiresias, for his advice. Please don't worry if you know what all these words mean. She's just giving him, Google Earth directions. You have to go to Hades and you have to talk to this guy, Tiresias. Now, the weird thing is he ends up saying closer to the bottom of the page is no living person, he says in 501, has ever sailed to Hades by ship before. So she ends up on page 276, there's a more specific set of directions. So I would just write in the margins of page 276, directions to Hades. It involves, pouring wine into the earth and, mixing that wine with things and saying certain prayers and sitting and drawing your sword and there's blood. And so you don't have to remember all the details, but it's super specific. Odysseus has to pay attention here and he has to follow all of these directions. And this person he has to talk to in the underworld, Tiresias, it says near the bottom of 276, line 538, the prophet, that's Tiresias, will soon come and he'll tell you about your journey measured out across the fish-filled sea and how you will get home. That's what you want to learn. That's the big takeaway. You got to follow all these directions, and that way you'll talk to the exact right person. Tiresias is a soothsayer. He tells the future. He's a significant character in the Oedipus plays, in the Oedipus the King. So it's a long way to get there, right? But Odysseus now has a very scary, but hopefully effective plan to get home. The last thing, easy to skim over, but I think Homer's really brilliant. That's a really obvious thing for an English teacher to say. But go to line 550. Odysseus, and again, he's talking to King Alcinous of the Phaeacians. That's the frame here. Odysseus says, they did as I had said, but even then I could not lead my men away unharmed. I mean, who would want to leave Xerxes' island, right? The youngest one, Elpenor was his name, circle Elpenor, not very brave in war, nor very smart, right? In my head, whose responsibility is that? Isn't that Odysseus's? But anyway, Elpenor was lying high up in the home of Xerxes, apart from his companions, seeking coolness since he was drunk. He heard the noise and bustle, the movement of his friends, and jumped up quickly. Forgetting to climb down the lofty ladder, he fell down, crashing headlong from the roof, and broke his neck right at the spine. His spirit went down to Hades. So people say you can't learn practical things from classic literature. They're wrong, because here you learn that if you're drunk, you don't sleep on a roof. So that's number one. Number two is I think Homer's aware of something that later on Shakespeare is super aware of I'm just thinking off the top of my head in stories like Henry V, and plays like Henry V, that there's a variety of kinds of death in war, and it's not all kleos, it's not all glory, it's not all heroic. Here, you have a soldier who survived 10 years of hand-to-hand combat who dies this way, right? Think of soldiers, think of General Patton who died in a Jeep accident. Think of soldiers who died because of friendly fire. Think of, So I just think it's not the most relevant thing, although we're going to meet him again in the underworld. Not a spoiler alert, minor spoiler. I just think it's interesting that Homer's awareness of how big his universe is even extends to the unheroic, to the everyday, typical sort of schlep who gets drunk and falls off a roof. I just think that's a really interesting detail. So something to think about after book 10 is that there's a lot of repeated moments in book 10. So there's more cannibalistic giants. There's also the temptations of another beautiful goddess, as I said. So something that is sort of a logical thing to think about is if the main sort of thematic moments in book 10 are similar to those in book 9 and in other books, What's new? What do we learn about Odysseus? What's added in book 10? So those are just some things to think about. I hope this was helpful, and good luck with your reading.